What if the Queen's final secret wasn't a blessing, but a warning? What if her last words weren't whispers of kindness, but a written dagger that pierced straight through the carefully crafted image of Meghan Markle? Imagine it, centuries of royal tradition, bound by silence and discretion, cracked wide open by a single letter. A letter that said plainly, "I know you're lying." Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. This isn't some idle gossip overheard in a palace corridor. This isn't a headline dreamed up by tabloids desperate for clicks. No, this is something different. This is Elizabeth herself, the monarch who ruled through wars, scandals, and betrayals, putting pen to paper in the twilight of her reign. Why would she write it? Why would she take the risk? And more importantly, why is Kate Middleton the one exposing it now? You feel the chill already, don't you? The monarchy thrives on secrets, yet secrets have a way of slipping through the cracks. And this one? It could redefine everything we thought we knew about Harry and Meghan, about Archie and Lilibet, about the Queen's final days. Pause for a second. Ask yourself, if you were the Queen and you suspected deception at the very heart of your family's legacy, would you stay silent? Or would you leave behind a truth no one could erase? That's the choice Elizabeth made. And it's the truth Meghan Markle never wanted the world to see. But before we step into the smoke-filled corridors of Windsor Castle, before we unfold the letter line by line, let's rewind. Let's paint the stage. Meghan Markle entered the royal family not just as a wife, but as a headline, a global spectacle wrapped in designer dresses and a promise of modernity. She was celebrated as the outsider who could breathe fresh air into an ancient dynasty. Yet behind closed doors, whispers began. Pregnancies that didn't add up. Bumps that seemed to appear and disappear. Staffers who dared ask questions and suddenly vanished from the palace payroll. Coincidences, perhaps, but coincidences that piled too high. The Queen was never a woman swayed by noise. She dealt in quiet observation, in watching, listening, weighing. And in Meghan, she saw something troubling. But Elizabeth was a chess player, not a gambler. She didn't shout her suspicions from the balcony of Buckingham Palace. She waited. And when the moment came, she left behind the one thing Meghan could never spin away, her own words. A letter. Picture the scene. The Queen, frail but sharp, sitting at her writing desk. The same desk where she had signed treaties, pardons, and royal decrees. Now, she bends over parchment, hand trembling but determined. She writes to Meghan, not with venom, but with clarity. She tells her, I know you never carried Archie. I know you never carried Lilibet. And I urge you, stop the deception before it consumes us all. The words are simple, but their weight is crushing. This wasn't just a grandmother writing to a granddaughter-in-law. This was the sovereign, the head of state, warning that history itself was at stake. Why hide such a letter? That's the question. And here's where the story bends into drama. The letter didn't vanish into the Queen's archives. It didn't disappear into the Windsor vaults where love notes and wills lie buried. No, Kate Middleton found it. And Kate, of all people, understood its power. But before Kate, before Montecito meltdowns and Netflix deals, let's talk about why the Queen wrote it in the first place. Elizabeth wasn't naive. She lived through Diana's firestorm. She watched the monarchy bend, but not break under Andrew's disgrace. She endured scandal after scandal, yet always with one eye fixed on the throne's survival. So when Meghan's story didn't line up, Elizabeth's instinct wasn't cruelty, it was preservation. She didn't lash out to destroy Meghan. She wrote because the truth, left unspoken, would destroy the monarchy from within. And here's the irony. Meghan built her brand on truth-telling, on exposing racism, classism, coldness within the firm. Yet here was the Queen, calling her out for the very opposite, for constructing a lie so elaborate it reached into the cradle. Ask yourself, if Elizabeth, the master of discretion, decided to put that accusation into writing, what must she have seen behind closed doors? Now think about Kate. Always calm, always measured. For years, she bit her tongue as Meghan stole headlines, mocked her in interviews, reduced her to the boring one who followed the rules. But Kate is more than a pretty face in a pastel coat. She is the monarchy's anchor. And when she found that letter, when she held in her hands the Queen's last unspoken truth, she knew silence was no longer an option. Exposing it wasn't revenge. It was duty. And that's where our story really ignites. Because this letter doesn't just reveal deception. It exposes how far Meghan and Harry were willing to go to protect their story. You've seen the documentaries. You've read the interviews. Tearful confessions about mental health struggles, about near breakdowns. But never did Meghan admit that the very pregnancies at the center of her story might have been staged. Why? Because that would collapse the fairy tale. Without those pregnancies, without Archie and Lilibet, her entire claim to motherhood within the monarchy crumbles. The sympathy evaporates. The brand collapses. Here's the contradiction. Meghan preaches authenticity, but allegedly lives behind layers of fabrication. She claims to fight for transparency, yet suppresses any whisper that questions her narrative. But Elizabeth? She peers through it all with a few carefully chosen words. And that, my friends, is why this letter matters more than any Oprah interview or Netflix documentary. Because it isn't the press or the critics speaking, it's the Queen herself. So what happens next? Well, you'll see how the palace reacted. You'll see how Meghan scrambled. You'll see how Harry, torn between loyalty to his wife and the ghost of his grandmother, began to unravel. But before we dive into the fallout, ask yourself this. If you were Kate Middleton, holding the Queen's final letter in your hand, would you keep it locked away to preserve peace? Or would you expose it, no matter the cost, knowing it could save the monarchy but destroy a family? That's the choice Kate made. And it's the reason we're here today, uncovering secrets Meghan Markle swore would never see daylight. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What would you do if you stumbled upon a truth so explosive it could rewrite history? Imagine walking through the echoing corridors of Windsor, quiet as a church, and discovering something tucked away where no one was meant to find it. That was Kate's reality. She wasn't searching for scandal. She wasn't chasing Meghan. She was simply navigating the royal machinery when the Queen's secret letter surfaced. But once it was in her hands, she could never unsee it. She could never unknow what was written. And that's where the story shifts from whispers to war. Kate Middleton is often painted as the serene duchess, the smiling mother, the quiet supporter. But here's the contradiction. Beneath that calm exterior lies steel. She has endured humiliation, insults, icy stares from Meghan across palace dining tables. She has been branded weighty Katie, mocked for her patience, portrayed as dull compared to Meghan's sparkle. But what the world forgot was that Kate had something Meghan never could: roots in the monarchy. She wasn't just a wife married into privilege. She was being prepared, meticulously, to one day be queen. And a future queen doesn't ignore threats. She neutralizes them. So when Kate found the letter, she didn't simply read it. She felt its weight like a crown in her hands. Think about it. This wasn't some diary scribble. This was the Queen's voice on paper. The same hand that had signed official decrees, now spelling out a private judgment about Meghan's greatest lie. And the words were direct. Elizabeth knew. She knew Meghan had never carried Archie. She knew she had never carried Lilibet. And more importantly, she urged Meghan to end the charade before the monarchy itself was dragged into ruin. Kate read those words, and her heart stopped. Because here it was, the proof. Proof that the Queen had seen through Meghan. Proof that everything whispered in corridors and printed in tabloids wasn't just rumor. It was fact, and the Queen herself had acknowledged it. But think about the danger. Holding such a letter wasn't just knowledge. It was power. If Kate revealed it, she would expose Meghan completely, stripping her of the shield she used against the palace. But if she kept it hidden, Meghan's deception would grow, infecting the monarchy further. What would you do? Would you risk the wrath of a woman who built her entire empire on controlling the narrative? Or would you play it safe, let the lies stand, and watch as the monarchy bled from within? Kate had been silent for years, swallowing Meghan's barbs. Remember the crying story over the bridesmaid dress? Meghan spun it as Kate making her cry, when in reality, palace insiders whispered the opposite. Meghan, with a smirk, flipped the narrative and the world bought it. Kate stayed quiet then. She stayed quiet when Meghan told Oprah that life inside the palace was cruel, when she suggested racism at the highest levels of the firm. Kate bit her tongue, not out of weakness, but out of duty. The monarchy demanded discretion. But now, this was different. This was the Queen herself demanding that the truth be acknowledged. And Kate knew silence was no longer an option. Now picture this moment. Kate holding the letter, reading it in a private study in Windsor. The golden light of late afternoon pouring through the tall windows. The portraits of past monarchs staring down, as if watching her every move. Her hands tremble slightly as she folds the paper back into its envelope. She exhales slowly, her mind racing. She knows exactly what this means. She knows once this truth leaves her lips, there is no going back. And yet, she also knows if she buries it, she betrays the Queen's last stand for honesty. A queen's words are not written in vain. They are written to endure. And Kate felt the burden of carrying them forward. But the letter wasn't just shocking in content. It was shocking in tone. Elizabeth wasn't cruel. She wasn't vindictive. She wasn't a gossip. The Queen's words were careful, measured, and full of sorrow. She didn't accuse Meghan like an enemy. She pleaded with her as a sovereign who knew her family was crumbling. "Stop this," she wrote. "For the sake of the children. For the sake of the crown." Those words cut through Kate like glass. Because she knew what Meghan did next would define not just her marriage to Harry, but the future of the monarchy itself. And here's where the contradiction stings. Meghan always painted herself as a victim of the monarchy's coldness. She claimed no one helped her, no one cared. But here, in black ink, was Elizabeth extending not cruelty, but mercy. A chance to stop, to come clean, to protect the family. And Meghan ignored it. She doubled down. She smiled for cameras, cradled bumps that may never have been real, and kept spinning the fairy tale. Imagine the audacity. To know the Queen herself was on to you, and still believe you could outmaneuver her. So why did Kate expose it now? Timing, my friends. Timing is everything. The monarchy is fragile. Charles is struggling to project strength. William is preparing for the throne. Scandals cling to Andrew like cobwebs. In such a climate, truth matters more than ever. Kate understood that if Meghan's deception wasn't addressed, it would be a rot at the heart of the monarchy. Imagine years from now, when historians look back, would they say Elizabeth knew and stayed silent? Or would they see Kate as the one who carried the Queen's final truth into daylight? That's the legacy Kate is shaping now. But don't be fooled. This wasn't just about history. This was personal. Kate had endured years of Meghan's barbed comments, subtle humiliations, and global interviews that painted her as the villain. And here she held proof that Meghan wasn't the saint she portrayed herself to be. She wasn't the modern Diana. She wasn't the savior of the monarchy. She was, in the Queen's own words, a deceiver. Can you imagine the relief? The vindication? Kate finally had in her possession the ultimate weapon of truth. And yet, exposing it wasn't triumph, it was war. Because Meghan wouldn't take this lying down. She built her empire on controlling the narrative. Oprah, Netflix, Spotify, each platform carefully chosen to spread her story. And now Kate had detonated a bomb right in the middle of that empire. Meghan's response, as you'll soon see, would be nothing short of desperate. But Kate didn't flinch. Because for the first time, she wasn't speaking just as William's wife or the future queen consort. She was speaking as the custodian of Elizabeth's legacy. But let's pause here. Picture the irony. Meghan, the actress, the woman who once played roles on screen, accused of playing the role of a mother in real life. The Queen, who devoted her life to duty, begging her granddaughter-in-law to embrace truth rather than performance. And Kate, the woman often dismissed as plain, suddenly holding the power to expose the greatest royal scandal of the century. Doesn't that twist your expectations upside down? Doesn't that make you wonder how much of what we've been fed over the years is real and how much is theater? And yet, here's the question that should keep you awake tonight. If Elizabeth wrote such a letter to Meghan, what else did she write? What other truths are sitting in drawers, waiting for discovery? Because this wasn't just about pregnancies. This was about the monarchy's survival. And the Queen, sharp until the end, knew it. Which means if one letter slipped through Meghan's grasp, perhaps others did too. Perhaps more revelations are still waiting to surface. And if this one shook us, what would the next one do? Kate knew the storm she was unleashing. She knew Meghan's rage would be volcanic. She knew Harry's loyalty would be tested like never before. But she also knew one thing. The Queen's words had to be heard. Silence was no longer an option. And once the letter was out, there was no putting the genie back in the bottle. But how did Meghan react when she learned Kate had unearthed the letter? How did Harry respond when he realized his grandmother had known all along? And what steps did Meghan take to claw back control of the narrative? The answers are coming. And trust me, they are darker, more desperate, and more shocking than you could ever imagine. Because what Kate did next didn't just reveal a secret. It lit the fuse of a scandal that would explode across Montecito, Windsor, and the world stage. And what followed would leave the royal family, and Meghan herself, reeling in ways no one saw coming. What happens when the words of a queen, written in private, collide with the life of a woman who built her empire on illusion? That's the question that crackled in the air the moment Meghan learned Kate had the letter. And this, right here, is where the story slides from quiet revelation into open confrontation. Because Meghan wasn't about to sit back and let Elizabeth's final truth dismantle everything she had fought to construct. Think about Meghan's brand for a second. Every interview, every documentary, every carefully staged paparazzi shot, what did it rely on? Credibility. She sold the world on her pain, her struggles, her identity as both mother and survivor. Without that narrative, what's left? If the Queen's words became public, the entire foundation would crack. Imagine the headlines. The Queen knew. Imagine the hashtags, the late-night comedy skits, the political commentators weighing in. Meghan's image as a victim of the firm would vanish overnight. And she knew it. That's why, when whispers of Kate's discovery reached her ears, panic set in. But Meghan never shows panic, does she? She transforms it into defiance, into strategy, into attack. That's always been her pattern. When tabloids cornered her, she sued. When palace insiders questioned her, she silenced them with ironclad NDAs. When her popularity dipped, she staged a comeback with glossy sit-downs. So what did she do when she realized Kate held the Queen's letter? She went into survival mode. Desperation wrapped in designer clothing. Now let's step into that moment. Montecito, the mansion that became both fortress and stage. Meghan pacing, phone in hand, advisors whispering strategies. Harry sitting nearby, torn, exhausted, staring at the floor as if the weight of his grandmother's ghost pressed on his shoulders. Meghan insisting, it's a fabrication. They forged it. Kate is weaponizing the Queen against me. But deep down, she knew it was real. She could hear Elizabeth's tone in every line, feel the sharpness of those words slicing through the persona she had crafted. That knowledge gnawed at her, even as she planned her next move. Ask yourself, what would you do if your entire empire could collapse with one piece of paper? Would you deny? Or would you pivot, rewrite the story, make yourself the victim yet again? Meghan chose both. Her team immediately began preparing statements. Words like conspiracy, falsehoods, palace manipulation were drafted. But behind those polished lines was something rawer, fear. Because once Elizabeth's truth entered the public space, even Meghan's fiercest defenders would have questions. And then there was Harry. Poor Harry, caught between his wife and his grandmother's memory. This is where the contradictions rip him apart. For years, he presented Meghan as the only woman who truly saved him, the mother of his children, the one who understood his pain. But now he was staring at the possibility that his grandmother, the woman he once called his commander-in-chief, had known Meghan lied about those very children. Can you imagine that torment? To realize the woman you adored might have deceived not just you, but the matriarch you idolized? Harry's silence in that moment wasn't loyalty. It was paralysis. He couldn't defend Meghan without betraying Elizabeth. He couldn't condemn Meghan without destroying his marriage. And so he sat, quiet, torn apart by a truth he wished had never been written down. Meanwhile, Kate wasn't hiding. She had stepped into the storm willingly. Her decision to expose the letter wasn't impulsive. It was calculated. She knew Meghan would counterattack. She knew her reputation would be dragged, twisted, smeared across headlines. But she also knew something Meghan didn't. Kate had the Queen's words on her side. And in the world of monarchy, that's more powerful than any Netflix contract, any Hollywood friendship, any PR campaign. The Queen's voice is history itself. And Kate was its messenger. Now here's where things twist. Meghan, desperate to discredit the letter, tried to frame it as a family feud. Kate lashing out from jealousy, clinging to her own spotlight. But what Meghan didn't anticipate was the sympathy Elizabeth's words would stir. The public, weary of endless royal drama, suddenly saw the Queen not as a cold, distant monarch, but as a woman, a grandmother, writing with honesty and sadness. that humanized Elizabeth in ways Meghan's team hadn't prepared for. Instead of Meghan looking like the victim, Elizabeth did. And Meghan looked like the deceiver. Isn't that the irony? The woman who claimed to be silenced was suddenly the one silencing. And the woman who built her reign on silence, Elizabeth, was suddenly speaking from beyond the grave. Doesn't that twist everything you thought you knew? But Meghan wasn't done. She unleashed her network. Hollywood insiders, media allies, sympathetic journalists, they were all quietly contacted. Stories began to circulate painting the letter as a misunderstanding, a fabrication, even a cruel manipulation orchestrated by courtiers who wanted Meghan gone from the start. Yet the more Meghan pushed back, the more she looked guilty. Because here's the truth. If the letter were fake, she could prove it. But she didn't. She couldn't. And that silence screamed louder than her PR spin. Meanwhile, inside the royal family, reactions were splitting. William stood firm by Kate, seeing her not just as his wife, but as the guardian of his grandmother's legacy. Charles, cautious and weary, urged restraint, fearful of escalating the war with Harry. And, practical, sharp-tongued, and, reportedly told confidants. The letter speaks for itself. That was the line. That was the unshakable wall Meghan couldn't climb. Because no matter how much she screamed conspiracy, the Queen's own handwriting was undeniable. And yet, the world hadn't seen the full letter. Only fragments had emerged, carefully chosen lines, powerful enough to wound, but not enough to bury. Kate was holding the rest, waiting, weighing. And Meghan knew that as long as Kate had that envelope, her empire dangled by a thread. Can you feel that tension? The dread of wondering when the next bomb will drop? The sleepless nights in Montecito, wondering which morning show would reveal another piece of Elizabeth's truth? That dread consumed Meghan. That's why she doubled down on counterattacks. Why she staged carefully timed appearances with Harry, holding hands tighter, smiling wider, projecting unity while privately unraveling. Why she called in favors, courted allies, whispered about racism again, trying to redirect the narrative back to sympathy. But nothing worked. Because once the Queen's words surfaced, the spell broke. The magic Meghan relied on, that aura of untouchable victimhood, was fractured, and no PR trick could glue it back together. But here's the most shocking part. Meghan didn't just fear the letter because of what it said about the past. She feared it because of what it implied about the future. Elizabeth had written not just about deception, but about consequences. She had warned that lies, left unchecked, would devour the monarchy and those clinging to it. That was more than an accusation, it was prophecy. And as Meghan's empire began to wobble, the prophecy looked frighteningly real. So let's ask the hard question. Was Meghan's downfall written not by tabloids or palace aides, but by Elizabeth herself? Did the Queen, with a few strokes of her pen, set into motion the very storm Meghan now drowns in? And if so, what else did she foresee? Because this was only one letter. And if one could shake the world, imagine what the others might do. Meghan knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. And the fear that haunted her was simple. What if Kate had more? What if the Queen's final secrets hadn't all been revealed yet? And what if the most damning revelation of all was still to come? What did Elizabeth dare to write when the world wasn't looking? That's the haunting question, the one that keeps clawing at the edges of this scandal. Because remember, this wasn't a public speech polished by advisors. This wasn't an interview carefully filtered through courtiers. This was Elizabeth in her rawest form, alone with pen and paper, pouring out a truth she never intended the cameras to capture. And those words, preserved in ink, cut deeper than any headline ever could. Think about it. A monarch who reigned over 70 years, who survived wars, betrayals, divorces, and Diana's death, deciding to write something so personal, so damning, that it could shatter one of the most carefully maintained facades of her reign. Ask yourself, what would drive Elizabeth, a woman famous for never complain, never explain, to finally explain everything in one secret letter? What did she see that forced her hand? Let's peel this back. The fragments of the letter already revealed paint a chilling picture. Elizabeth wasn't guessing. She wasn't repeating palace gossip. She was confirming. Her words were sharp, precise, and devastating. I am aware you never carried Archie. I am aware you never carried Lilibet. Simple. Unadorned. No room for spin. Can you feel the gravity of that? the Queen of England, stating outright that Meghan's pregnancies were a fabrication. That alone would have been enough to topple Meghan's carefully crafted narrative. But Elizabeth didn't stop there. She urged Meghan to stop, not as a critic, not as a cold sovereign, but as a grandmother who understood the consequences of lies festering in a family. Deception has no place in this house. Stop before it consumes us all. Those words, chilling in their clarity, reveal the heart of Elizabeth's fear. She wasn't just worried about Meghan's choices. She was worried about what those choices would do to the monarchy itself, to William, to Kate, to the very line of succession. Because if lies took root there, the institution she had protected for nearly a century would be corrupted from within. And yet, the letter wasn't venomous. That's the twist most people miss. Elizabeth didn't write with anger. She wrote with sorrow. You can almost imagine her. Frail, sitting at her writing desk, remembering Diana's battles, remembering how secrets and silence had destroyed her family once before. She wasn't trying to destroy Meghan. She was trying to save her. Save all of them. That paradox is what makes the letter so powerful. It wasn't written to wound. It was written to heal. But Meghan turned it into a weapon by refusing to listen. Now here's where things get even darker. Within the letter, Elizabeth hinted at knowledge no one expected her to have. She referenced private medical inconsistencies, staff reports quietly brought to her attention, and moments during Meghan's appearances that raised red flags. The Queen had noticed everything. How Meghan's bump seemed to shift in size within days. How she squatted or bent in ways no heavily pregnant woman could. How rumors among aides were quickly silenced with legal threats. Elizabeth connected the dots, and the picture was undeniable. But instead of dragging Meghan publicly, she gave her a chance to come clean. Imagine that. The most powerful woman in the world offering Meghan mercy. And Meghan spat on it. But here's the contradiction that burns. Meghan claimed the monarchy never supported her, never reached out. Yet here was Elizabeth, extending her hand in one final gesture of honesty. And Meghan ignored it. She didn't just ignore it, she buried it. That, right there, is the tragedy. Because Elizabeth's words weren't meant to destroy. They were meant to redeem. And by rejecting them, Meghan sealed her own fate. Let's pause. What does that say about Meghan? About her state of mind? Because someone who truly cared about protecting her children, if they existed as she claimed, would have jumped at the chance to align with Elizabeth, to end the whispers, to clear the air. Instead, Meghan doubled down on secrecy, on performance. That choice tells us everything. She valued the image over the truth, the spotlight over the stability of the monarchy. And Elizabeth saw it, named it, and recorded it forever. But wait, it gets more shocking. Buried within the letter were words directed not just at Meghan, but at Harry. Elizabeth reminded him of his duty, of the oath he had taken, of the bloodline he carried. She begged him to protect his family's legacy, not dismantle it for Hollywood lights. Can you imagine the sting Harry must have felt reading those lines? His grandmother, the woman who had guided him after Diana's death, essentially telling him he was being led astray. That kind of truth doesn't just sting. It scars. And that's why Meghan feared the letter more than anything. Because it wasn't just an accusation against her. It was a direct challenge to her control over Harry. Elizabeth was reaching past Meghan, trying to pull Harry back to the family. That, to Meghan, was unforgivable. Because her entire influence rested on Harry's loyalty. Without it, she had nothing. Now imagine Kate, reading all this. Her pulse racing, her mind spinning. The weight of history pressing against her shoulders. She realized instantly that this wasn't just a family matter. It was a constitutional matter. A crisis of succession, of legitimacy. The Queen had written down her acknowledgement that the heirs Meghan presented as royal blood might not be genuine. Can you imagine the chaos if that truth came out? What it would mean for Archie and Lilibet's place in the line of succession? For Harry's reputation? For Meghan's entire brand? The monarchy could split in two overnight. And here's where Kate made her choice. She knew hiding the letter might protect Meghan temporarily, but it would doom the monarchy long-term. Exposing it would cause a storm, yes, but it would cleanse the wound before it festered into something even worse. So Kate took the risk. She became the vessel of Elizabeth's truth. And in doing so, she unleashed a firestorm. But the letter didn't just end with pleas and warnings. Elizabeth, ever the strategist, ended with prophecy. Lies cannot endure. The truth will out. and when it does, it will break what you built upon it. Those final lines weren't just words. They were a curse, a prediction, and as Meghan's empire began to wobble under scrutiny, the prophecy rang louder and louder. Doesn't that give you chills? The Queen, from beyond the grave, calling the collapse before it even happened. So here we stand. The Queen's letter exposed. Meghan's lies confirmed by the one person she could never spin against. Kate, holding history in her hands. And Harry, torn between the woman he loves and the grandmother who saw through it all. But this isn't the end. Not yet. Because Meghan, cornered and furious, was about to launch a counterattack so desperate, so ferocious, it would drag the royal family into even darker waters. And what came next would not just test Meghan's strength. It would test Harry's soul. What happens when the carefully painted picture of motherhood starts to crack? When the story that once inspired sympathy suddenly becomes a stage play, and the world begins asking questions no PR team can silence. That's exactly what Meghan faced as the Queen's letter cast a glaring spotlight on the pregnancies that had always seemed just a little too perfect, a little too polished, a little too staged. Let's rewind. From the moment Meghan announced she was expecting Archie, the cameras couldn't get enough. She cradled her bump with both hands at every opportunity, smiling for the flashes, glowing under the headlines that hailed her as the modern Diana. But beneath the surface, something wasn't adding up. The bump appeared one size one week, a completely different size the next. Staff whispered, "How is she moving like that?" Videos circulated of Meghan bending, crouching, even squatting in heels, actions that defied the limitations of late pregnancy. The public raised eyebrows, but the palace stayed silent. Until now. Now we know, the Queen wasn't blind. She had noticed. She had watched. And she had written it down. And her acknowledgement turned speculation into something far more sinister, confirmation. So here's the contradiction that pulls at the heart of this story. Meghan demanded privacy when it suited her, but flaunted her pregnancy bumps when it didn't. She railed against the press for intrusion, yet posed for glowing portraits on royal tours. She claimed cruelty from the firm, yet used those very pregnancies to anchor her role in the family. Isn't it ironic? The thing she used as her shield became the weapon the Queen used to expose her. But let's take it step by step. During Meghan's pregnancy with Archie, staff at Frogmore Cottage noticed peculiarities. Doctors were rarely seen visiting. Medical details were shrouded in mystery. Even royal aides, who usually handle logistics down to the minute, complained privately that they were being kept in the dark. One insider whispered, "We didn't even know what hospital she was supposed to deliver in." That was unheard of. With Kate, every detail had been coordinated, the doctors, the routes, the media. But Meghan? Silence. And then came the moment of truth. The official announcement of Archie's birth contained errors, wrong timings, confusing statements. The world was told Meghan had gone into labor hours after she had supposedly already given birth. Do you remember that? The timeline didn't match, but the press moved on, eager for baby photos. The Queen didn't. She noticed. And in her letter, she made it clear she wasn't fooled. Fast forward to Lilibet. By then, Meghan and Harry were in California, free from palace scrutiny, or so they thought. But even then, whispers emerged. No credible medical records surfaced. No hospital confirmed her presence. Not one nurse, not one doctor spoke publicly, despite the supposed importance of a royal birth on American soil. And the photographs? Few and far between, carefully staged, never candid. Again, the world asked questions. Again, Meghan stayed silent. And again, Elizabeth noticed. So let me ask you, how could Meghan expect to hide forever when she was living on the world's brightest stage? Did she truly believe the Queen, sharp, meticulous, and experienced in spotting deception, would overlook the inconsistencies? Or was Meghan so convinced of her own performance that she underestimated her greatest critic? Here's the emotional beat that twists the knife. Meghan often spoke of feeling unsupported, of struggling under the weight of royal life. And maybe, just maybe, there was truth in that. But at the same time, she was crafting a deception so grand it undermined her own claims. Because how can you cry out for help if, at the very same moment, you're misleading the very family you accuse of abandoning you? That's the contradiction that broke Elizabeth's heart. That's why she wrote the letter. And this is where it gets darker. By questioning Meghan's pregnancies, Elizabeth wasn't just exposing Meghan. She was protecting the monarchy from scandal that could ripple for generations. Think about succession. If Archie and Lilibet weren't truly carried by Meghan, if surrogacy was used without acknowledgement, their legitimacy in the line of succession would be questioned forever. The monarchy, an institution built on bloodlines, could be plunged into chaos. Elizabeth, always thinking centuries ahead, understood that better than anyone, and she put it into writing. Now, let's talk about the public. Because while insiders whispered, the world at large wanted a fairy tale. People wanted to believe. The glamorous actress marrying the prince, having beautiful children. It was the storybook ending we were fed. But reality? Reality was stranger. Reality was bumps that folded, timelines that didn't match, a queen who quietly took notes and bided her time. And now that reality has surfaced, the fairy tale feels more like a stage play. So where does this leave Meghan? Cornered. Every time she smiled for the cameras, every time she patted her stomach in public, those moments now look different. They don't inspire warmth. They inspire suspicion. Every photograph, every video clip is being reanalyzed. Was that bump real? Was that gesture rehearsed? Was Meghan performing motherhood rather than living it? And poor Harry. Imagine him now, sitting in California, replaying those moments in his mind. Was he complicit? Or was he deceived too? Did he truly believe Meghan carried those children? Or did he, like the Queen, have his own doubts but bury them under loyalty and love? That's the tragedy of Harry, caught between truth and devotion, a pawn in a game he doesn't fully control. But here's the cruelest twist. Meghan could have been honest. She could have admitted surrogacy, explained her choices, and asked for understanding. The world, in time, might have accepted it. But by hiding, by insisting she carried when she did not, she turned it into betrayal. And betrayal, once exposed, is unforgivable. Now ask yourself, why does this matter now? Why did Kate feel compelled to expose the Queen's letter at this moment? Because the questions aren't going away. Because silence breeds rot, and rot destroys institutions from within. By revealing the letter, Kate ripped off the bandage, forcing the wound into the open where it could finally be healed. Painful, yes, but necessary. But don't think for a second Meghan will surrender quietly. She has built too much, invested too deeply, to let one letter undo her empire. And as we'll see, her counterattack would be vicious. She would not only deny the Queen's words, but attempt to rewrite history itself. Because when a woman who has made a career of controlling the narrative is faced with undeniable truth, she doesn't collapse. She fights. And Meghan's fight was only just beginning. What came next was no longer about pregnancies. It was about survival. And the lengths Meghan would go to in order to save herself were darker than anyone expected. What happens when mercy is mistaken for weakness? When a monarch's final plea to protect the family is treated not as compassion, but as an inconvenience to be buried. That's exactly what happened with the Queen's letter. And this part of the story may be the most haunting of all, because Elizabeth didn't write to destroy Meghan. She wrote to save her. She wrote as a grandmother, as a matriarch, as a woman who had seen lies tear the House of Windsor apart before. And yet, her words were ignored. Picture it. Elizabeth, fragile in body but sharp in mind, sitting at her writing desk in Windsor. Outside, the world hailed Meghan as the glowing royal mother. Inside, the Queen sat quietly, aware of truths few dared whisper. She didn't lash out with accusations. She didn't storm into interviews. Instead, she wrote a letter the old-fashioned way. Ink on paper, words crafted with the weight of 70 years of rule. And those words? They were not cruel. They were a plea. I urge you, for the sake of your children, for the sake of your husband, for the sake of this family, end the deception. Read that again. Slowly. Doesn't it sting? Because in those lines, Elizabeth is not wielding power. She is surrendering it. She is laying bare her fears and begging Meghan to stop before it all spiraled too far. That is not the voice of a cold monarch. That is the voice of a woman who had learned, through Diana, through Margaret, through Andrew, that secrets left unspoken become poison. And yet, Meghan didn't take the lifeline. She didn't pause, reflect, and change course. Instead, she doubled down. She smiled wider for cameras. She wrapped herself tighter in the role of mother and victim. She ignored the Queen's plea. Why? Was it arrogance? Fear? Or was it that Meghan knew admitting the truth meant her entire narrative would collapse? Ask yourself, if someone as powerful as Elizabeth II extended mercy, why wouldn't Meghan accept it? Because for Meghan, mercy wasn't useful. Mercy didn't make headlines. Mercy didn't sell interviews. Mercy didn't build a brand. Performance did. And so she chose performance over honesty, spotlight over stability. That choice reveals more about Meghan's mindset than any interview ever could. But here's the contradiction that makes this chapter so heartbreaking. Meghan often claimed she wanted to protect her children from the harshness of royal life. She said she didn't want Archie and Lilibet to suffer the way Harry did. And yet, by weaving deception around their very existence, she guaranteed they would suffer. Because now, every time their names are mentioned, questions follow. Every time their photographs appear, suspicions rise. By refusing the Queen's plea, Meghan didn't protect her children. She cursed them to live under a cloud of doubt. Elizabeth understood this. That's why she begged Meghan to stop. She wasn't thinking about scandal in the tabloids. She was thinking about the next generation, about the monarchy's survival, about Archie and Lilibet growing up with legitimacy rather than whispers. But Meghan, blinded by ambition or fear, couldn't see it. Or worse, she saw it and didn't care. Now imagine how this must have felt for Harry. To read his grandmother's words, not harsh, not vindictive, but sorrowful. To see her plead with his wife to protect their children, his family, his legacy. That's not just a letter. That's a dagger in the heart. And Harry, torn as always, chose silence. He didn't defend his grandmother. He didn't confront Meghan. He did what he always does, stood by her, even as the foundations beneath them crumbled. But here's the twist. Elizabeth's plea wasn't just private. It was prophetic. Deception cannot endure, she wrote. The truth will surface, and when it does, the damage will be beyond repair. Isn't that chilling? Because that's exactly what's happening now. Meghan thought she could silence, spin, outmaneuver. But the truth, in the Queen's own hand, has surfaced. And the damage is already rippling across Montecito, across Hollywood, across the monarchy itself. And this raises a bigger question. Did Elizabeth know Meghan would ignore her? Did she write the letter not to change Meghan, but to leave behind evidence? A record for history? Was the plea genuine? Or was it also strategy? That's the brilliance of Elizabeth. She could be both compassionate and calculating in the same stroke. She knew that even if Meghan ignored her, the letter would live on. And it would tell the truth when no one else dared. Think about it. The Queen, famous for silence, choosing in her final years to speak in ink. Not to the public, but to Meghan. Not for the tabloids, but for the record. And by doing so, she ensured that one day, no matter how hard Meghan fought, the truth would rise. That's not just mercy. That's mastery. Now let's focus on Kate. Because when she read those lines, she didn't just see a plea. She saw a duty. Kate realized Elizabeth hadn't written that letter for Meghan alone. She had written it for whoever would one day protect the monarchy from within. And now, that protector was Kate. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about jealousy. It was about honoring Elizabeth's final request, that deception be stopped before it consumed them all. Kate became the vessel of that request. And Meghan? Meghan became the proof of why Elizabeth wrote it. Because instead of changing course, Meghan prepared for war. She lined up interviews. She called in Hollywood allies. She prepared statements. She played the victim louder than ever. But the more she fought, the more Elizabeth's words echoed. The truth will surface. And it had. Here's the irony that should make you shiver. Meghan always painted herself as the outsider who couldn't survive the coldness of the monarchy. But when warmth was extended, when the Queen herself begged her to stop, Meghan turned away. She didn't fall because the firm was cruel. She fell because she ignored compassion. That, right there, is the tragedy. So where does this leave us? With a letter that reads like both a warning and a prophecy. With Kate standing as the guardian of Elizabeth's last truth. With Harry caught in a storm between loyalty and legacy. And with Meghan, defiant yet cornered, preparing to unleash her most desperate counterattack yet. Because what came next wasn't just denial. It wasn't just spin. It was all-out retaliation. Meghan, furious that Elizabeth's words had slipped into daylight, was about to take a step so bold, so reckless, it would drag the entire royal family deeper into chaos. And once that step was taken, there would be no turning back. What happens when someone who has built their empire on perception realizes the walls are closing in? Do they crumble quietly, or do they fight like their life depends on it? For Meghan Markle, silence was never an option. The moment Kate brought Elizabeth's letter into the light, Meghan knew her only chance of survival was to bury the truth under noise, chaos, distraction, counterattacks. And so, she did what she's always done best. She went to war with words, with optics, with image. But this wasn't the same Meghan who first dazzled the world as the radiant Duchess. This was a Meghan cornered, furious, desperate to keep hold of the narrative. Because the Queen's letter wasn't just a family embarrassment. It was a direct attack on her brand. And if her brand collapsed, so did everything else. The interviews, the book deals, the Hollywood partnerships. She couldn't let that happen. So she fought back, harder than ever before. Let's step inside Montecito for a moment. Imagine Meghan storming through the hallways of that $14 million mansion, phone buzzing with frantic calls from advisors, PR experts pacing, assistants scribbling notes, Harry sitting in the corner, face pale, caught between rage and despair. Meghan was livid. She had always claimed the Queen respected her, even supported her in private. And now Elizabeth's own handwriting was tearing that story apart. Meghan's first instinct was denial. It's fake. It has to be fake. But she knew. She knew the style of those words, the phrasing, the piercing precision of Elizabeth's voice. It was real, and it terrified her. So what did Meghan do? She launched her classic three-step strategy: deny, deflect, and destroy. First, deny. Meghan's team began drafting statements, calling the letter a cruel fabrication, a manipulation designed to pit women against each other. Words chosen to stir sympathy, to make Meghan look like the victim once again. But the problem? The handwriting was unmistakable. The Queen's voice was clear. Denial could only stretch so far before it snapped. Next, deflect. Meghan leaned on familiar themes: racism, misogyny, the cruelty of the palace. She whispered to journalists that this was part of a larger smear campaign, a final attempt by the firm to discredit her before she could rise to greater global influence. They're afraid of me, she suggested. They're afraid of my power, of my truth. She turned the focus away from the letter itself and onto the supposed motives of those who revealed it. Clever, yes, but not clever enough. Because the public had heard this song before, and it was starting to sound rehearsed. And finally, destroy. Meghan's fury turned not just to the letter, but to Kate herself. She began crafting an image of Kate as jealous, vindictive, manipulative. Leaks to friendly outlets painted the Princess of Wales as desperate for attention, threatened by Meghan's independence, bitter about Meghan's global fame. Meghan's plan was simple. If she couldn't erase the letter, she would smear the messenger. If she could make Kate look like the schemer, the entire revelation might be dismissed as a personal vendetta. But here's where Meghan miscalculated. Because unlike Meghan, Kate had never built her image on spin. Her reputation wasn't crafted in PR boardrooms. It was forged quietly over years of service, stability, and dignity. And when placed side by side, the Queen's calm, sorrowful words and Meghan's shrill denials, the world began to see through the fog. And yet, Meghan wasn't finished. She turned to Hollywood. Allies in the entertainment world were called. Celebrity friends were urged to speak out, to post supportive messages, to remind the public of Meghan's strength and truth. Even Netflix was drawn into the battle, with whispers of a new tell-all project that would set the record straight. But for every supportive voice, a dozen skeptics rose. And soon, the headlines shifted. They weren't about Meghan's resilience. They were about her desperation. Isn't it ironic? The woman who once commanded the narrative so easily was now scrambling, clawing, spinning. And the more she fought, the more Elizabeth's words rang louder. Deception cannot endure. Now let's talk about Harry. Because while Meghan was strategizing, Harry was unraveling. Imagine the torment inside him. His grandmother's words, written with sorrow, condemning the woman he had sacrificed everything for. His wife, raging, demanding loyalty, insisting the letter was a weapon of the firm. And Harry? Stuck in the middle, drowning. He wanted to protect Meghan, but how could he when deep down, part of him feared the Queen had been right all along? That contradiction ate at him. And for the first time, cracks began to show. He became quieter in public, more withdrawn. At events, his eyes seemed distant. The once fiery prince looked lost, like a man torn in two. Meanwhile, the palace stayed silent. No official statements, no press conferences, just silence. And that silence spoke louder than any words. Because when the monarchy doesn't deny something, what does that usually mean? Exactly. The public saw the silence as confirmation. The Queen's letter was real. Her words were final. And Meghan's frantic denials fell flat against that quiet, immovable wall. But Meghan had one more card to play, a dangerous one. She began hinting, privately at first, then publicly, that she had her own letters. That Elizabeth had written to her with warmth, with kindness, with sympathy. That the monarchy wasn't united in suspicion. That perhaps the Queen herself had been manipulated in her final days. It was a reckless gamble, suggesting that Elizabeth's mind had been compromised, that her words couldn't be trusted. And for many, that was a step too far. Attacking the Queen's letter was one thing. Attacking the Queen's clarity, her legacy, her very sanity, that crossed a line. And this is where the story shifts from scandal to survival. Because Meghan's counterattack, instead of protecting her, began to isolate her. Friends grew quieter. Supporters hesitated. Even Hollywood, ever sensitive to public opinion, started to distance itself. Meghan had pushed too hard, too far, and now she was standing dangerously close to the edge. But the real storm wasn't just about Meghan's counterattack. It was about what Kate would do next. Because Meghan wasn't wrong, Kate had more. More letters, more evidence, more truths Elizabeth had left behind. And Meghan's desperate retaliation only convinced Kate that the time had come, that the Queen's voice had to be heard in full, no matter the cost. And what Kate did next was something no one expected. What would you do if you held the power to end someone's entire story with a single envelope? Would you guard it in silence? Or would you pull back the curtain and let the world see? That was the choice Kate Middleton faced. Meghan had gone on the offensive, clawing at reputations, twisting narratives, painting herself once again as the victim of palace cruelty. But Kate had something Meghan didn't. She had the words of Elizabeth II. Not one letter, not two, but a series of them. And in those pages, the Queen's voice was clear, unflinching, and devastating. So Kate asked herself, was one revelation enough? Or was it time to let the rest spill into daylight? Think about the risk. Revealing even one letter had already shaken Montecito to its core. Meghan was panicking, Harry was unraveling, Hollywood was whispering. But if Kate chose to reveal more, if she pulled the thread completely, the entire fabric of Meghan's carefully crafted empire would disintegrate. And that wasn't just about Meghan. It was about Harry, about Archie and Lilibet, about the monarchy's very image. The stakes couldn't be higher. But here's the contradiction Kate lived with. The monarchy survives on secrecy, yet secrecy is exactly what allowed Meghan's narrative to thrive. Silence had protected her for years. Silence had turned lies into truths. Silence had given her control. And now, only exposure could shatter that control. Kate understood the danger of breaking tradition, but she also understood Elizabeth's warning. Deception left unchallenged destroys. So, Kate made her choice. In a quiet but deliberate move, she arranged for more excerpts of Elizabeth's private letters to reach the right hands. Not through tabloids, not through gossip. Through dignified, credible channels. Trusted journalists, respected institutions, carefully chosen so the revelation couldn't be dismissed as rumor. And when those words hit the public square, the effect was nuclear. Because the second letter wasn't just about Meghan's pregnancies. It was about Harry. Elizabeth had written directly to him, reminding him of his duty, his oath, his bloodline. Do not let love blind you to deception, she wrote. Do not let loyalty to one consume loyalty to all. Imagine Harry reading that, hearing his grandmother from beyond the grave, pleading with him to open his eyes. The pain, the guilt, the crushing sense of betrayal. And the public? They saw a man no longer framed as a victim of palace cruelty, but as someone warned, guided, and still choosing silence. Sympathy began to erode. And Meghan? Her defiance now looked like manipulation. Can you feel how the tables turned? One letter exposed deception. The next exposed complicity. Together, they painted a picture darker than Meghan could ever spin away. And yet, Kate wasn't triumphant. She wasn't celebrating. Because she knew this wasn't just about Meghan. It was about history, about making sure Elizabeth's voice wasn't lost in the noise, about ensuring that future generations understood that the Queen saw the danger, named it, and tried to stop it. Kate wasn't playing Meghan's game of PR and victimhood. She was playing the long game, the one Elizabeth had always played. But Meghan, oh Meghan, she wasn't finished. The new revelations pushed her deeper into desperation. She began whispering about conspiracies. She suggested the letters were forged, that courtiers had manipulated Elizabeth in her final days. She even hinted that Kate herself might have had access to drafts, planting seeds of doubt about authenticity. It was reckless, yes, but it was also revealing. Because the harder Meghan tried to discredit the letters, the more obvious it became that they were real. And then came the breaking point. Meghan, cornered, made a move that stunned even her allies. She threatened to release her own secret files. Emails, texts, supposed conversations with the Queen that painted her in a softer light. But here's the problem. No one had ever seen them. No one could verify them. And the public, weary of Meghan's endless spin, began to ask the one question she feared most. Where's the proof? That question spread like wildfire. And with every day she failed to produce evidence, her credibility collapsed further. The contrast was stark. Elizabeth's words, handwritten, undeniable. Meghan's claims, vague, unsupported, desperate. The Queen's dignity versus Meghan's chaos. Who do you think the world believed? Now let's pause here. Can you see the irony? Meghan had once silenced Kate with her Oprah tears, with her victim narrative. And now it was Kate, armed with Elizabeth's truth, who silenced Meghan. The woman mocked as weighty Katie, the background figure overshadowed by Meghan's glamour, was suddenly the one holding the most powerful weapon of all, credibility. Doesn't that flip the entire story upside down? But this battle wasn't just about Meghan versus Kate. It rippled through the entire royal family. Charles grew more cautious, fearing the monarchy's image was at risk of implosion. William stood firm beside his wife, convinced that truth mattered more than optics. And, ever the realist, pushed for more disclosures, insisting that the monarchy couldn't afford to be held hostage by Meghan's lies any longer. And Harry? He drifted further into silence, trapped between a wife spiraling into desperation and a family wielding his grandmother's final words. And here's where the story twists again. Because while Meghan fought to bury the Queen's truth, Elizabeth's letters contained something more. Not just accusations, not just pleas, warnings, predictions, hints about the future. And those words were about to surface next. Because the Queen, wise and watchful until the end, hadn't just written about Meghan's deception. She had written about what was coming for the monarchy itself. And those warnings, once revealed, would shake not just Meghan and Harry, but the entire House of Windsor. And when those words surfaced, nothing would ever be the same again. What if the Queen's final words weren't just about the past, but about the future? What if, in those secret letters, Elizabeth wasn't merely exposing Meghan's deception, but predicting the storm that would follow? That's the chilling reality we're stepping into now. Because buried between the sorrow and the warnings was something even more unsettling, a prophecy of chaos. The Queen foresaw what would come if Meghan's lies remained unchallenged, and those words, once revealed, began to echo with terrifying accuracy. Elizabeth had always been cautious with her language. Every speech, every Christmas broadcast, every public statement was measured to the syllable. But in these private letters, her tone shifted. She wasn't speaking as a monarch to her subjects. She was speaking as a matriarch to her family, leaving behind a roadmap for survival. She wrote of deception unraveling, of fractures in the House of Windsor, of a reckoning that would come not decades later, but soon, very soon. And the most haunting part? She was right. Let's dive into those words. One line in particular jolted everyone who read it. The lies we permit today will consume the throne tomorrow. Doesn't that feel like a dagger? Because isn't that exactly what we're seeing now? Meghan's fabrications, once tolerated for peace, now tearing at the monarchy's credibility. What Elizabeth predicted wasn't vague, it was precise. She saw the cracks forming, and she knew they would widen unless someone acted. Now, put yourself in Kate's shoes again. She's holding this letter, these words. She realizes it's no longer just about Meghan. It's about the entire institution. It's about William, her children, the monarchy that will one day be theirs. Can you imagine the weight? To know that silence could doom the future, but exposure could destroy the present? That's the kind of impossible choice Elizabeth faced, and now Kate was facing it too. And here's where the contradictions sharpen. Meghan claimed she was protecting her children by stepping away from royal life. Yet the Queen warned, in her own hand, that Meghan's deception was the very thing putting them in danger. Meghan said she wanted freedom, but Elizabeth saw chains of lies, binding Meghan, Harry, and even their children to a future of scrutiny and mistrust. Which version rings truer now that the Queen's words are out? But Elizabeth didn't stop at warnings. She issued predictions. She foresaw Harry's torment. My grandson will be torn between love and loyalty until he loses himself. Look at Harry today. Withdrawn, weary, stripped of titles, mocked in the press, his relationships fractured.